Sarah Wells stood behind the counter of the small grocery store on 9th Avenue, staring at the clock mounted above the exit sign. Her fingers were raw from scanning groceries for the past 8 hours. Her back ached from standing too long, and she still had a night shift ahead of her cleaning offices on the east side. The woman in front of her dropped a black credit card on the counter without looking up from her phone. She wore a fur-lined coat and diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent light every time she shifted her head to speak into her wireless headset. Sarah slid the card through the terminal, bagged the organic produce, and mumbled the standard thank you as she handed over the receipt. The woman didn't answer. She took the bag by its very edge, like it was contaminated, and walked out without a glance in Sarah's direction. Sarah didn't react. She was used to this. She had worked enough jobs in the past decade to know when someone thought they were better than her. None of it mattered. What mattered was finishing this shift, catching the crosstown bus before it stopped running, and getting home in time to make sure Jacob had something warm to eat before he went to sleep. Rent was due next week, and she was already calculating how much more overtime she could ask for without getting fired. Jacob was 12 years old. He had grown up fast because he didn't have a choice. His mother couldn't afford babysitters or after-school programs, so Jacob walked home from school alone, made himself sandwiches for dinner, and waited for his mother to get home from work. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for toys or video games. He didn't act out. He just watched. And he remembered everything. 2 weeks earlier, on a cold Thursday night, they had walked home together after Sarah's double shift at the diner. It was close to midnight, but the lights from the jewelry store on Main Street were still on. She had paused in front of the window for no more than 5 seconds, staring at a silver bracelet resting on a black velvet cushion. It was thin, polished, and engraved with a single word on the inside. Hope. She didn't say much. She only shook her head once and muttered under her breath that pretty things weren't for people like them. Then she kept walking, faster this time, because she knew there was no sense in wanting what she could never have. Jacob didn't forget that moment. He had seen something in his mother's face that night. Something he couldn't name, but understood. He decided he was going to buy that bracelet for her. It was the first time in his life he had made a decision that big on his own. For the next 12 days, Jacob did whatever he could to earn money. He washed cars when it was so cold his fingers cracked. He collected cans and bottles for recycling. He walked dogs until his legs hurt. He even cleaned the back alley behind Mr. Lee's shop, scrubbing the concrete until his knees bled through his jeans. By December 23rd, he had saved exactly $37.45. The bracelet was marked at $49.99, and he convinced himself the difference was something he could talk the clerk into overlooking. He left the apartment just after 5 in the evening, wearing 2 sweaters under his jacket and gloves that didn't cover his fingers. The sky was already dark. He walked the 2 miles to the store because bus fare was another $2 he didn't have. The sidewalks were slick with ice, and his shoes weren't waterproof. By the time he reached the store, his socks were soaked through. Inside, it was warm and bright, but it didn't feel welcoming. The walls were white, the glass cases spotless, and the woman behind the counter wore a black suit with a silver brooch shaped like a rose. She saw Jacob immediately and frowned. He felt her eyes travel over him, stopping at his shoes, then at the rolled cuffs of his 2 short jeans. He approached the counter slowly, took out the folded bills and coins he had counted 5 times at home, and set them down. The woman stared at the money for a moment before reaching under the glass for the bracelet. Jacob thought she was going to wrap it up and hand it to him. Instead, she set it on the counter but didn't let go. She said the price had gone up. Holiday pricing, she explained flatly. $65. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She just waited. Jacob stood there, unsure what to do. He counted the money again, even though he knew exactly how much it was. He asked if she could make an exception, just this once. She shook her head without hesitation. He thanked her anyway. He picked up his money, stuffed it back into his pocket, and turned toward the door. He was halfway across the room when he heard the door open behind him. At first, he didn't pay attention. People came in and out all the time. But then the room went silent. The kind of silence that makes you stop walking, even if you're not sure why. Jacob turned his head and saw a man walk in. Tall, wearing a long black overcoat, red tie, no hat. His hair was a pale gold color, combed back. He didn't look like he was in a hurry, but everyone else seemed to move aside without being asked. The clerk straightened up immediately. Even the man who was browsing watches set down what he was holding and stepped back. Donald Trump stood in the center of the room and looked directly at Jacob. It wasn't a glance. It wasn't casual. He looked at him like he had been searching for him. And in that moment, Jacob knew something was about to happen. Something big. But he had no idea how big. For a few seconds, Jacob couldn't move. His legs felt like they weren't listening. Donald Trump didn't say anything. He just kept looking at him. Not with the kind of stare Jacob was used to, pity, judgment, indifference, but like he was already part of something that had started before he even realized. Trump turned to the clerk without breaking his focus on Jacob and said something Jacob didn't catch. The woman behind the counter froze, nodded once, and quickly reached for the bracelet again. She placed it back on the glass top, but this time without that look she had earlier. This time, she handled it like it mattered. Trump took a few steps forward, slow but certain. He pulled out his wallet. Not one of those bulky ones full of receipts and cards, just a thin fold with a few crisp bills. He peeled off a $100 note and laid it down on the glass. There was no hesitation in his movement. He didn't ask how much the bracelet was. He didn't negotiate. He didn't speak to Jacob. He just put the money down and nodded once at the clerk. She wrapped the bracelet in tissue paper, slid it into a box, and handed it to Jacob like she was handing over something precious, not because she wanted to, but because she knew she had no choice. Jacob stood there holding the box. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of what had just happened. He didn't know what he was supposed to say. His throat was tight, his palms were sweating inside his gloves, and he could feel his heart pounding against his ribs hard enough that it made his fingers shake. Trump turned toward him and tilted his head toward the door, as if signaling for him to follow. Jacob did. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't like he had a plan. It wasn't like he could just say no. He followed him out onto the sidewalk where the cold hit him instantly, cutting through his jacket and the sweaters underneath. But he didn't feel it as much now. His hands clutched the box tighter as Trump stepped toward a black SUV parked by the curb. The engine was already running. The driver stood next to the rear door holding it open. Trump didn't speak until they were both inside the vehicle. The door shut quietly behind them. The noise of the city disappeared. It was warm in the back seat. The seats were leather. Jacob could feel the heater blowing gently under his feet. Trump asked him his name. Jacob answered. Trump asked about his mother, where she worked, how long she'd been working there, how she managed. Jacob told him everything. He didn't leave anything out. He told him about the diner, about the cleaning jobs, about how she tried to take classes years ago but had to drop out because Jacob had been sick and someone had to stay home with him. He told him about the night his mom had stopped in front of that window and said she wished she could have something like the bracelet. He told him how he'd saved every coin, how he thought maybe this one gift would make her believe that things could be different. Trump listened without interrupting. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't glance away. He watched Jacob the entire time. When Jacob finished talking, Trump nodded slowly, as if making a decision he had already made but wanted to be sure about. He made a call. Jacob couldn't hear what was being said. Trump's voice was quiet but direct. A few minutes later, he put the phone away and said they were going to make a stop. Jacob didn't ask where. He just sat back against the seat and held the box on his lap, the tips of his fingers rubbing the edge of the cardboard like it was an anchor. The SUV pulled into an underground garage of an office building Jacob didn't recognize. It was tall, made of glass and steel, with a lobby full of marble and people in suits. They didn't go through the front entrance. They took a private elevator straight up, and when the doors opened, a woman in a gray suit was already waiting. She had a folder under one arm and a tablet in her hand. She smiled at Trump and gave Jacob a quick glance before leading them down a hall. The office they entered was quiet. No windows, just clean lines and dark furniture. Trump sat down behind a desk and motioned for Jacob to sit in the chair across from him. The woman placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside was a set of documents Jacob didn't understand. The woman explained that they were enrollment forms for a scholarship program. Full tuition, books, fees, childcare covered if his mother needed it. No cost to them. No repayment. Not a loan. It was real. All she had to do was sign. Jacob stared at the forms. He asked why. Why her? Why now? Why him? Trump leaned forward, rested his arms on the desk, and said it was because of what Jacob had done. Because of the way he had stood at that counter, with almost nothing, still trying. Because people like Sarah Wells didn't ask for help. They just worked until they couldn't anymore. He said sometimes people needed someone to step in before they broke completely. Jacob didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to speak. Trump told him they would take the forms to his mother tomorrow. He told him to be ready at noon. The SUV drove him home in silence. Jacob got out in front of his building and watched the car pull away before he went upstairs. His mother was still at work. He sat at the table with the bracelet box in front of him and waited. Hours passed. He didn't move. When she finally walked through the door, tired and cold, he handed her the box without saying anything. She opened it slowly. She looked at him with a question he didn't know how to answer. And when she asked where it came from, all he said was that something had changed. Something big. The next morning, Jacob woke before the sun came up. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator click as it struggled to warm their small apartment. His mother was already in the kitchen, quietly moving plates and making instant coffee. She hadn't said much the night before. After opening the bracelet box, she had stared at it for a long time, then put it back carefully, as if afraid it would break. She hadn't asked questions after that, and Jacob hadn't volunteered anything. But now, as she sat at the table reading over the classified ads in the paper, she looked at him differently. It wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to worry, like she was bracing herself for bad news. She didn't know that in 3 hours, Donald Trump's car would be pulling up in front of their building. Jacob waited for the knock without telling her. He watched her clean the apartment for the 3rd time that morning, even though it was already spotless. She wiped down the counter, swept the floor again, and even took a rag to the window frame, scrubbing away dust no one else would have noticed. Every few minutes, she glanced at the bracelet on her wrist, then looked away quickly, shaking her head as if to remind herself not to get used to it. At noon exactly, the black SUV parked outside. Jacob stood by the window, watching as the driver stepped out and opened the rear door. His mother followed his gaze, then turned back toward him with a look he couldn't read. She asked him what was going on. He told her to wait. The knock came, sharp and measured. She hesitated for a second before opening the door. Donald Trump stood there with his assistant at his side, holding a folder. He greeted her by name and stepped inside like he had done it 100 times before. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stared as he walked to the kitchen table and sat down without waiting for an invitation. The assistant followed, laying the folder neatly on the table and opening it with practiced efficiency. Jacob's mother stood there for a long moment before slowly sitting down across from them. She folded her hands on the table, but they weren't steady. Jacob could see the small tremble in her fingers as she looked at the papers being placed in front of her. Trump explained everything. He spoke plainly, without decoration or unnecessary detail. There was a scholarship. It was hers, if she wanted it. Full tuition, books, fees, any childcare support she needed while attending classes. There was no debt, no repayment, no conditions. The paperwork had already been completed, pending only her signature. She asked why, not with anger or skepticism, just confusion. She asked why a man like him would bother with someone like her. Trump answered without hesitation. He said it was because of her son, because Jacob had stood in that store, trying to buy something for her that he couldn't afford and never once asked for a handout. He said he could see what kind of person raised a kid like that. For a long time, she said nothing. Jacob watched her eyes move over the documents again and again, as if the words might change if she read them enough times. Her breathing was shallow. He could see her trying to figure out where the trap was, because there was always a trap. There had always been a catch, or a hidden cost, or fine print that turned hope into something ugly. But there wasn't any fine print this time. She took the pen the assistant offered and signed her name on the lines marked in yellow. Her hand didn't shake when she did it. She handed the pen back, then sat perfectly still as the papers were collected and returned to the folder. Trump stood up first. He said they would be in contact with her regarding class schedules and orientation dates. His assistant handed her a card with a phone number and an email address. She took it, holding it lightly between her fingers like it might dissolve. Before leaving, Trump looked at Jacob. He didn't say anything this time, just gave a single nod, as if confirming something unspoken. They left without fanfare. No cameras, no reporters. No one outside the apartment knew what had just happened. Jacob and his mother sat in silence for a long time after the door closed. The folder was gone, but the space it had occupied on the table still felt full. She finally broke the quiet by saying she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. Jacob told her to go to class. The following week, Sarah Wells stepped into a classroom for the first time in 16 years. She carried the same bag she used for work, filled now with notebooks and textbooks. She sat in the front row, her back straight, her hands still for the first time in months. She took notes carefully. She asked questions when she didn't understand something. She stayed after class to review her work. At home, Jacob saw the difference immediately. She stopped falling asleep at the kitchen table with bills scattered in front of her. She stopped skipping meals to save money for rent. She still worked part-time at the diner, but only enough to cover what wasn't already being taken care of. The rest of her time was spent studying, reading, preparing lessons she hoped to teach one day. Jacob didn't ask her how it felt. He could see it on her face every time she came home from campus. 3 weeks after classes started, another package arrived. No note this time. Just a laptop, a printer, and a stack of books she hadn't been able to afford yet. She opened the box slowly, then sat down at the table without saying anything. She plugged in the laptop, opened the lid, and stared at the screen for a long time before she started typing. Jacob never saw Trump again, but the choices he made that day followed them, quietly, every step after. Spring came slowly that year. Sarah Wells spent most of her days on campus and most of her nights at the kitchen table, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard of the laptop she'd received without explanation. The routine was strict. She woke before sunrise, made coffee, read for an hour before Jacob left for school, and took 2 buses to the college. Her days were filled with lectures, assignments, and tutoring sessions she signed up for even when she didn't need them. She said she wasn't going to give anyone a reason to question whether she deserved to be there. Jacob didn't argue. He understood. They both knew exactly what was at stake. Jacob finished middle school with grades good enough to get him noticed by a teacher who suggested he apply to a magnet program across town. He hadn't planned on it. He assumed he would stay at the same underfunded school he had always gone to, but his mother told him to fill out the application. When he said it might be a waste of time, she didn't answer right away. Then she told him they didn't have time to waste on giving up. He finished the application that night. By summer, Sarah was offered a paid internship at the elementary school 5 blocks from their apartment. It wasn't full-time, and the pay wasn't much, but it was steady. It was enough. She stood in the living room that morning, holding the letter in both hands, reading it twice before folding it carefully and placing it on the table. She said they'd be fine. Jacob wasn't sure whether she was saying it to him or to herself. The work wasn't easy. The kids in her class were behind, and half of them didn't care about catching up. She stayed late every day, grading papers and rewriting lesson plans until they worked. When Jacob walked home after his own classes, he passed the schoolyard sometimes and saw her on the playground, sitting on the bench with 2 or 3 of the kids who always got sent out of class. She wasn't scolding them. She was talking, listening. Jacob never stopped to watch for long. He just noticed. Late in the summer, when the days were longest and the apartment was too hot to sleep in, Sarah got a call from the director of the program. She'd been approved for a full teaching certificate if she finished her last semester without failing grades. She didn't react the way Jacob thought she would. She didn't cry or cheer. She sat down at the table, stared at the window for a long time, and finally said she would finish. Jacob never asked whether she thought about that day in the jewelry store. He never asked whether she still wore the bracelet. She kept it in the box on her nightstand most days. But sometimes, when she left in the morning for campus or for work at the school, he'd notice it on her wrist again. Always on the days when she had something important to do. By fall, things started to shift in ways neither of them expected. Jacob was accepted into the magnet program. Sarah finished her internship and was offered a permanent position at the school. She didn't hesitate this time. She signed the papers the same day and took the job. Jacob came home to find her standing in the kitchen with 2 new blouses on hangers, tags still attached. She said she'd gotten them on sale, and Jacob nodded like it made sense. She didn't need to explain. In November, a letter arrived addressed to Sarah from an office Jacob didn't recognize. Inside was a simple note. It said congratulations on her certification and included a donation slip for the scholarship fund she'd been part of. There was no request, no demand, just a quiet reminder that she could choose to help someone else if she wanted. She didn't say much about it. But a week later, Jacob saw her filling out the donation form at the kitchen table. That Christmas, things were different. They bought a new tree, not because they needed one, but because his mother said it was time. They placed the bracelet box at the top, right under the star. She told him it wasn't about the bracelet. It was about remembering the moment things changed. Jacob understood. By the end of that year, they weren't rich. They didn't live in a big house. But the rent was paid on time every month. There was always enough food in the fridge. The lights stayed on. His mother didn't have to work nights anymore. She didn't come home exhausted, carrying the weight of everything alone. Jacob knew most people would never understand how much had changed from that single day in the jewelry store. He knew they would never know what it meant for someone like Donald Trump to step in and make a decision that turned everything around. But he didn't need them to understand. He had lived it. 2 years later, Sarah Wells stood in front of her second-grade classroom writing vocabulary words on the whiteboard. Her handwriting was careful, clean. She spoke slowly, making sure every kid in the room understood the instructions before they opened their notebooks. At the back of the room, a boy with worn shoes but sharp eyes copied down every word without being told twice. She noticed. She always noticed. After school that day, she stayed behind to clean up the desks and organize the homework folders. It was quiet after the students left, the kind of quiet she hadn't experienced in years. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing out a lesson plan for the next week. Outside, the sky had turned dark by the time she gathered her things and turned out the lights. Jacob was already home by the time she got there. He had made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta with tomato sauce. But he had set the table, and he had even remembered to put out the cloth napkins she kept in the back of the drawer. He was taller now, his voice deeper, but he still watched her the way he always had, with the kind of focus that told her he saw more than he let on. They ate together, and afterward, she sat at the table drinking tea while Jacob worked on his college applications. He asked if she wanted to read one of his essays. She said yes. He handed it to her and waited. She read carefully. He wrote about her, about what it meant to see someone start over when they thought they were out of time. He didn't mention Trump by name. He didn't have to. The story wasn't about him. That night, Sarah placed the bracelet back in its box after wearing it to work. She kept it on a shelf now, not because she didn't value it, but because she no longer needed it as a reminder. She told Jacob she was thinking about applying to a graduate program. He told her she should. She said she would think about it. But they both knew she had already made up her mind. On Christmas Eve, they decorated the tree together. They still used the same ornaments they'd had for years, except now they added one new piece each time. When they finished, Jacob handed her the small velvet box, and she placed it at the top of the tree, just like every year since it all began. It wasn't about luck. It wasn't about tradition. It was about remembering. That same evening, Sarah checked her email one last time before bed. A message had come in from the school office. A family was struggling. The mother had lost her job. There was a kid in her class who hadn't turned in homework for weeks. Sarah read the message, closed her laptop, and sat quietly for a minute before making a call. She asked for the family's contact information. She wanted to help. No one told her to. No one expected her to. But she remembered what it was like when no one did. Jacob watched her from the doorway. She hung up the phone and smiled faintly, then told him she would handle it. He didn't question it. He knew she would. The next morning, they woke early and walked together to the community center where donations were being collected. Sarah handed over a box filled with clothes, books, and supplies. She didn't give her name. She didn't tell anyone why she was there. She just handed it over and left. By the end of that year, Jacob received his college acceptance letter. Sarah hung it on the fridge with the same pride she'd had when he brought home his first spelling test with a perfect score. She told him she always knew he'd get in. He told her he had never been sure. She laughed and said he never listened. They never saw Donald Trump again. There were no more letters, no calls, no packages. But neither of them forgot what he had done. He hadn't just bought a bracelet or covered tuition. He had given them a moment when everything could change, and they had done the rest. Sarah kept teaching. Jacob went to college and later graduated with a degree in engineering. Their lives moved forward. They worked. They earned what they had. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would sit at the table, turn the bracelet over in her hands, and remember the day when someone decided she mattered. And every year, when they decorated the tree, they placed the box at the top and said nothing about it. It didn't need words anymore. The story wasn't about charity. It wasn't about luck. It was about what people can do when they're given a chance, and what they choose to do for others when they remember how it feels to be on the other side.